You know, it's a true honor for me actually to do all these presentations today and to introduce our guest speaker for today. I met JT back at North Georgia. JT is a North Georgia College graduate, by the way, you know, so that, yay. And about, I don't know, 10 or 11 years ago, no, longer than that, 13 years ago, some of you remember we did a memorial up at North Georgia for the 29 former cadets that were killed in the Vietnam War. One of those former cadets was JT's dad. JT's dad was a helicopter pilot and was killed in action in Vietnam. And when we were putting that program together, we were trying to locate family members to help read the names of the KIAs. And at that time, JT was a colonel at the Army War College. And he very kindly came down and assisted us with that program. When he left the War College, he went on to command the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, which is, they're called the Night Stalkers. I guess one of the reasons that JT is one of my personal heroes is the fact that if my dad had been killed in a war, I'm not sure that I would have gone in the Army. And if my dad had been a helicopter pilot, I'm not sure I would have done that either. But he did both, and not only did he do both, but he spent time with what is arguably the premier helicopter aviation unit in the world. These guys just do a whole lot of flying at night. They take on some really tough missions that most of the time we don't know anything about. They are, without question, the finest helicopter pilots anywhere. So JT and I were talking earlier about not volunteering for anything, which of course he does. He is also an inductee in the Georgia Military Veterans Hall of Fame, as is his dad. In fact, they were inducted in the same class. And JT has agreed to assume the position of the Deputy Director and Chief Executive Officer of that organization. So he's going to be working with our own Rick White in that. So without further ado, JT is going to tell us, he was the Air Mission Commander during the bin Laden raid, and he's going to tell us about what all went into that. So come on up, JT.
So as a Gold Star grandson, and as a Gold Star son, and as a third of fourth generation Army aviators, I am more than honored to speak to a wonderful group of warriors who I have a very much an affection for. And as I've grown older and become even more involved in some of my father's squadron mates, it is that much more of a feeling of affection that I have for this group of individuals. Outside of all the unnecessary politics that surrounded this nation's involvement in Vietnam, of which my generation will probably suffer a little bit of, not near to the level of you did with our involvement in both Iraq and Afghanistan, given the outcome. That's a whole nother war story, political discussion that we can get into, but we won't. And that's not why I'm here to talk to you today. But I do want to mention something before I get into some of the mission explanations or mission descriptions. I want to say something that's always on my heart around this time of year. And as you all know, we're entering somewhat of a chaotic election period coming up in our nation. And I don't take sides, but I do encourage everyone to get out and vote. That is our most effective non-kinetic weapon that we have as a citizen of this great country. I know you know that, okay? But what I'm asking you is to proliferate that. Kids, grandkids, friends, they got to vote. They got to participate. Now is the time to get serious, if you weren't serious prior to this, about where our country is headed. So please, pass that along. And I say that as an eyewitness in 2005 during the Iraqi and Afghanistan's first so-called democratic elections, in which we supported the government, not directly, but indirectly. It was their people that set up the polls, their police that protected the polls, and their governments that formed and led their countries. Now, we can argue about good, bad, or indifferent, how that turned out. And we all understand how those countries sit today. But given the 8 years that we were in Iraq, and given the 20 years that we were in Afghanistan, the eternal optimist within me knows and has to believe that the seeds of democracy were planted in those countries and will come up once again. Maybe not in your lifetime, maybe not in my lifetime, but I truly feel that that is the case. So, 1966, I figure y'all were around that time. A band by the name of Circle, spelled Cyrkle, I won't do the phonetics, opened for another band called the Beatles. Circle went on to have only 2 of their songs in the top 100. The Beatles, on the other hand, went to be the most famous rock band of all time with the most #1 hits. Chances are my comments will leave an impression on you sort of like the band Circle did, instead of like the Beatles did, all right? So with that, I'll lead off with a spoiler alert and then an upfront apology. If you read chapter 17 of Admiral Bill McRaven's book, Sea Stories, and I do recommend the whole book, and Chris Wallace's book, Countdown Bin Laden, and as of most recently, Mike Vickers' book, By All Means Available, they tell a far more riveting story about the Bin Laden mission than I could ever deliver. And we don't have near the time for a blow-by-blow account of all that transpired over the several weeks of planning that led up to the mission and the mission itself. I realize I am on the stopwatch, but believe me, I could spend 15 minutes to 15 hours talking about the amazing heroes I had the unique opportunity to not only serve with, but lead during a pivotal time during Operation Iraqi Freedom, Operation Enduring Freedom, and the global war on terrorism as a whole. When I've given remarks about Operation Neptune's Spear in the past, I will always refer to them as my 73 days of the Bin Laden mission. And the reason I chose that description was the number 73 was specific to me and me alone. On February 17th, 2011, my boss, Admiral McCraven, called me, asked me where I was, and asked me how soon I could get to Fort Bragg. Fort Bragg at the time, now Fort Liberty. Coincidentally, I was already at Fort Bragg visiting some other training, so I told him I could be there in about a half an hour. I assumed I was going to meet him at JSOC headquarters, but he said, come to his quarters. Now, there's only one or two reasons your boss summons you to his quarters, and it's usually not for milk and cookies. But believe it or not, I actually had milk and cookies because the boss's wife, Georgianne, had just fixed a fresh batch. So my mind starts racing when I get in at the kitchen table, and I said, what kind of boss serves a man milk and cookies and then hands him his pink slip? You know, that just isn't right. So I sat down at the kitchen table. I was sure to take 2 or 3 or 4 cookies because if I was going to get fired, it was going to be on a full stomach. To my relief, Admiral McCraven did not fire me, but he did look me straight in the eye and said that the intel community is pretty sure they found Osama bin Laden and that we need to develop a plan to go and get him. I remember literally stopping the chewing process, and as professionally as I could, looked him straight in the eye and said, BS. Although I think I said the entire word, and given that we're in a church, I won't say that. But I'm pretty sure we both laughed because we had experienced this before, no less than 4 or 5 times. When some other country's intel agency or ours would get a supposed lead on the world's most wanted terrorist, and we would spin up to go and get him, meaning nothing was there. But it was always a dry hole, meaning nothing was there. But he reassured me that this was different and described some of the intel. Well, that conversation over milk and cookies was 73 days from the time we would conduct the mission into Abbottabad, Pakistan, to capture or kill Osama bin Laden. And the reason those 73 days was specific to me, the manner in which every asset involved with the mission was told at varying times. Just to provide a little context, the agency discovered the Abbottabad compound in September of 2010. They studied it, reconned it for about 3 months before they informed the Secretary of Defense, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and Admiral McCraven in January 2011. Admiral McCraven spent approximately 3 weeks with 2 other planners and some analysts from the intel community to discuss the macro options, including airstrikes, clandestine operation, helicopter raid, and a variance of all 3 of those. So I was told in February 17th to be exact, and beginning on that day, both myself and the SEAL commander, who was told the day before me, started to hand select the forces that would conduct this mission. That came with its own set of challenges, and I'll share some of those with you. My number 1 rule throughout the planning and rehearsal process, I kept telling myself, was to keep it simple. I made the mistake of using that word simple early in the planning process in front of some senior leaders at the national level. So Admiral McCraven politely asked me to choose another word because he didn't want it to seem like we weren't taking the mission seriously or we were overconfident in our abilities. He had spent several years inside the Beltway, both on the National Security Council and other senior roles, so he was very good at reading a room, especially full of politicians and their appointees. But in a subsequent briefing, I had slipped up and used the word simple again. And one person asked me to expound on what I meant by simple. While trying to avoid eye contact with Admiral McRaven, I explained the mechanics of the mission were not unlike the hundreds, if not thousands, of missions the Night Stalkers, along with their supported ground forces, perform on a nightly basis throughout Afghanistan and had been doing so since the initial invasion in October of 2001. Needless to say, simple was stricken from my vernacular from then on, and I replaced it with a more acceptable word, routine. Well, that part was not the routine. Was the fact that the objective was in a so-called allied nation. The target was the number one most wanted terrorist, and there was an established integrated air defense system which added to the complexity of the mission. The need for compartmentalization was of the utmost importance, which is why I explained how I was informed of the mission over milk and cookies. So imagine choosing from a highly skilled organization consisting of 3,200 of the best helicopter pilots, crew chiefs, and support personnel in the military, and to select just a few, 24 to be exact, that would conduct the most important mission of one's lifetime. My first step in choosing the crews was to talk to the SEAL team commander, who I had known for years and had been on several deployments with. We discussed the pilots that he and I were most comfortable with and had operated with in that particular theater of operations the most. After selecting the flight lead, I had him in turn select his crew and other aircraft crews because I needed him to be completely comfortable with not only those in his aircraft, but the other aircraft that were behind him. But I told him he could not mention the actual objective until I received permission from Admiral McRaven, who in turn had to receive permission from the White House. It wasn't until after several rehearsals did we reveal what the actual target was. Coincidentally, Libya was heating up at the same time, so it provided a convenient cover story for our initial planning sessions and multiple trips to and from the DC area. As I was going through the approval process of the crews that my flight lead had selected, I reflected on my first day in command of the Night Stalkers. This unit that I had the privilege to serve in for several years had lost 46 Night Stalkers from its inception on October 18th, 1981 to September 11th, 2001. Just shy of 20 years and having been involved in every combat operation from Operation Urgent Fury to Just Cause to Desert Shield, Desert Storm to Gothic Serpent and several other classified operations. Since the global war on terrorism began in 2001, we had lost 43 Night Stalkers. And on my first day in command, part of the transfer of responsibility when the incoming regimental commander is given a binder that consists of the biographies of every Night Stalker that died while serving in the regiment, either in combat or in training. And on the backside of those biographies are all the living relatives' names. And every year, on the day their Night Stalker left our formation, that family member receives a handwritten note from the regimental commander reaffirming at least two things. One, that their Night Stalker will never be forgotten. And two, the regiment will be there to support them for the rest of their lives. Now, you may view that handwritten note as a grim reminder to the family, but in this particular unit, the families understand the depth of sacrifice and the importance of the mission that their loved one, along with the elite ground forces, are expected to perform. The thought of adding another name to that binder weighed on me heavily throughout my time in command, but especially during the train-up for this particular mission, primarily because of the importance of the target, his location, and the expected resistance. But there was an equal level of comfort I felt knowing that there was no more capable group of warriors with equal capable families behind them that could perform this type of mission. So as I reviewed the crews that would conduct this mission, I prayed over each one and asked God to spare me the task of having to write a family member reminding them how heroic their Night Stalker was. As the intelligence continued to build and we continued to rehearse more and more, we consistently updated our nation's leadership on the plan while not using the word simple. Now, as I mentioned earlier about the macro options that were discussed, you can only imagine that there might be some inter-service as well as interagency tensions or competitions associated with this mission. As the planning process matured, everybody had their own best version of how to get America's #1 most wanted enemy. We, JSOC, were extremely careful not to make any assurances that we knew couldn't be delivered. In the end, our force was chosen due to the fact that no one else had the unique capabilities that we did, and like I said previously, we had been doing the same types of missions for the previous 10 years, making the complex look not simple, but routine. So the time comes to deploy to our forward location in Afghanistan and wait for the clearance to go. That was the easy part, seeing as how there were an additional 100,000 troops or so already in Afghanistan. We conducted our final rehearsals, and the night after we get to our forward location, I received a call from my deputy commander back at Fort Campbell saying something has happened at our home station and to our hangars, and he's going to go into work and will update me as soon as he gets there. He calls me later and tells me an EF-3 tornado has hit the airfield at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, and damaged several aircraft in our hangars. Well, the damaged aircraft just so happened to be the ones that are prepped for alert in the United States and designated to go anywhere in the world for a mission of national importance. So you may be thinking to yourself, aren't you on a mission of national importance? Yes, but when only about a dozen or so people in Washington, D.C. know where you are you really there? Needless to say, I told Vinny, my deputy commander at the time, to inform the chain of command and begin to reconstitute the alert package as best as he can. He began to do so, but mentioned that he may have to recall aircraft and crews from the other locations around the world, which may indirectly lead to unnecessary questions about what's currently going on. He was right, but in a brief moment of leadership weakness, I just simply told him in the calmest voice I could. Probably came off more like a whimper. I was like, Vinny, just fix it. I knew he would, because quite honestly, his capabilities far exceeded mine. And that's why I chose him to be my deputy commander. Reinforcing the rule, surround yourself with much smarter people than yourself. A few hours before we launched on the mission, I spoke to the air crews and reminded them not of the national importance of the mission, but more so of the thousands of routine missions that they had performed over the past 10 years. I concluded with an excerpt of our unit's creed that says, I serve with the memory and pride of those who have gone before, for they loved to fight, fought to win, and would rather die than quit. We've all heard of Murphy's Law, correct? Well, even the most elite units are not immune to having Murphy show up at the most inopportune time. But the great equalizer is we plan for Murphy, even more so than we do when he doesn't decide to show up. And that came in quite handy as the primary assault helicopters were approaching the target compound. The lead aircraft experienced an aerodynamic occurrence known as settling with power, which basically means it was operating in its own recycled air, which causes a lack of lift. And the way you avoid it is to simply fly out of it. Well, that wasn't an option, because it would have wasted valuable time getting the force on the ground. So the lead pilot executed a well-placed forced landing inside the walls of the compound because he knew that was the plan. In fact, we had rehearsed that version of the plan more so than we did any of the other contingencies. Needless to say, that raised a few eyebrows back in the Situation Room in Washington, D.C. As I said earlier, we planned for Murphy, and even before I got on the radio to send in the additional aircraft, one of the lead pilots that had the quick reaction force on board had already begun to lighten his load by dumping excess fuel and heading to the objective. I realize all this may sound like a bad day at the office, but I assure you that it is a special operations version of routine. With the additional assaulters on the ground, the objective was secured in a matter of minutes, 32 to be exact. But we also had to deal with gathering the massive amounts of intelligence found on the target and destroying the downed aircraft. And when everyone returned to the forward operating base, one of the SEALs came up to me, embraced me in a huge bear hug, and looked me straight in the eyes and told me blowing that daggum thing up was the best part of the mission. I did not find it that humorous at the time. So we got the bad guy and we got out of theater as soon as possible. A few days after we redeployed stateside, we were notified that we were to be paid by a special visit by the President and some key national leaders. And what was supposed to be a brief meeting of thank yous and small talk turned out to be 4+ hours of discussion on how we were able to accomplish what someone in the room referred to as the most daring mission since Doolittle's raid on Tokyo in April of 1942. I so wanted to use the word simple during that briefing with the President, but I feared Admiral McCraven would shoot lasers out of his eyes and kill me right there on the spot. I did, however, use the word routine, and I explained that if you consistently train for and consistently execute the most difficult missions in the world, even the most difficult missions will seem routine. In the months following the missions, I'll be honest with you, there was a certain feeling of invincibility, especially given the fact that this unit that I was so privileged to have commanded conducted 6 other missions in various places around the world that same night the world's most wanted man was taken down. But that invincibility was abruptly ended when one of my commanders burst into my office saying there's been a training accident, which resulted in 2 unfortunate deaths. That's 2 more names on our memorial wall, 2 more biographies in the regimental commander's binder, and more handwritten notes that have to be written every year. There's another line in our unit's creed that says, "And when the impossible has been accomplished, the only reward is another mission that no one else will try." All these experiences helped shape the person I am today. And when I took the uniform off over 7 years ago, I knew some of those experiences would easily carry me through the new chapter in life. One in particular, good leaders turn complex into simple. Surround yourself with those type of people, and if your boss doesn't like that word, use a routine. Thank you very much for the honor to speak to you. God bless you, God bless your families, and God bless this great country.